This man could be a spy. Any one of these people could be a spy.
If the political scandal of the Profumo affair of the early 1960s had brought the Cold War into national focus, films such as 1964's Ring of Spies, based on the true case of the Portland Spy Ring, an espionage group that passed on secrets to the Soviet Union between 1953 and 1961, sowed seeds of paranoia across the manicured lawns of everyday suburbia. The early years of the 1960s had also introduced the suave, ultra-masculine super spy James Bond into the equation, offering succour to those seeing dastardly commies on every street corner by always beating his man in the end, tying up loose ends and getting the girl. Bond had the romance, the glamour, the style and the win ratio. How could we lose the Cold War with such men doing the deadly deeds no ordinary mortal could ever do? But we didn't really believe this, did we? It was into this environment the Ipcress File was released in 1965. The film has become one of the totems of the 1960s, as much a signifier or leitmotif of the so-called golden decade as the Yeah Yeah Yeahs of the Beatles' She Loves You, Mary Quant and the Miniskirts, and footage of young people wandering along Carnaby Street in brightly coloured clothes. It is so deeply embedded into the culture, its power to recall all those elements we now associate with the 1960s remains undiminished 2 decades into the 21st century. However, it is not a film that alludes to any of the myths of the 1960s. Much has been made of the fact that the Ipcress File deliberately avoids any whiff of a swinging London, and therefore its grittiness and realism are more impacting. But this is a misnomer. Not every film made in London or the UK during the 1960s succumbed to highlighting pop culture. It might seem this way, but this is the power of the myth. Casting Michael Caine as the insubordinate but smart Army Sergeant Harry Palmer, plucked from his criminal tendencies in the Berlin black market to work in British intelligence, was a masterstroke. It is this and John Barry's superlative soundtrack that turned the Ipcress File into an iconic 1960s film. Based on Len Deighton's novel of the same name, producer Harry Saltzman wanted the Ipcress File to be a downbeat and ironic alternative to his hugely successful Bond franchise. But with Caine as Palmer, he got more. The Ipcress File was Caine's second major film role after playing the upper-class Lieutenant Gonville Bromhead in 1964 Zulu, and his first as the main star. Speaking in a London working-class accent gave Palmer a truthfulness and a difference that would have been lost if he had been using the received pronunciation actors were wont to use. And, crucially, it set him apart from his superiors.
You just love the army, don't you?
Oh, yes, sir. I just love the army, sir.
It also framed Palmer in the moment, a new world trying to brush aside the old, working-class voices in prominent positions, aspirational vigour with new ideas against the old guard in a struggle that dominated the decade. Palmer, investigating those responsible for the brain drain of Western scientists to the Eastern Bloc, has to do so in a modern post-war world of tit-for-tat absurdity, while dealing with a stifling pre-war old-school environment of the Ministry of Defence, one composed of regimented bureaucracy, red tape, interdepartmental friction, rivalry and mistrust. Seeing a working-class actor in such a role and the idea that the working classes were involved in espionage was groundbreaking. It brought home the Cold War shenanigans to the front doors of everyday people in the same way Cathy come home would for homelessness a year later. In many ways, seeing Harry Palmer exist in his home environment has more in common with what became known as kitchen sink dramas than it does with glossy Hollywood and the Bond franchise. But Palmer wasn't simply the anti-Bond, or his antithesis. Bond only exists on the screen. It's impossible to imagine him walking down the street with a loaf of bread under his arm. Any such view would ruin his mystique. When the lights go up, Bond ceases to exist. Palmer was a character existent in the real world. We see Palmer, who fancies himself as something of a gourmet, cooking in his cheerless bedsit while listening to classical music. We see Palmer pushing a shopping trolley and buying tinned mushrooms. Palmer, like millions of other everyday young men, could be found on any Saturday night in every smoke-filled, sticky-carpeted boozer in London, knocking back warm beer and chatting up the birds and hoping to get lucky. Palmer lived amongst the population in a way Bond never could. and with the perceived gloss and romanticism of espionage stripped away, it was left brutally bare and as it really was. Ordinary men from one place tussling with ordinary men from somewhere else, and, as Palmer would discover, be expendable pawns in a pointless charade a couple of wrong steps away from nuclear Armageddon. Interestingly, Palmer, while seemingly rebellious and lacking the requisite loyalty, performs his duties with vigour and intelligence, even appearing to want the appreciation of his superiors. It appears an unlikely dynamic, but one seemingly built on an atavistic impulse of acceptance of the established order that drove the British Empire. In a sense, it is possible to see Palmer as cannon fodder, a localised view of centuries of conflict. Placed between the sly ambiguity of Guy Dolman's Colonel Ross and the punctilious Major Dolby, played by Nigel Green, Palmer's vulnerability increases, and he is kidnapped and put through the induction of psychoneurosis by conditioned reflex under stress, Ipcress. Bond was made for this environment. Palmer is forced into it.
Your eyelids are getting heavy.
Yes, the choice of camera shots is very self-aware and knowing, but it is never pretentious. Now we see them as very 1960s, both part of the aesthetic of the film and the era. Director Sidney J. Fury and cinematographer Otto Heller, using the Techniscope 35mm shorter focal length lenses, allowed a greater depth of field to be in focus, and so we see these unusual shots from odd angles where both the foreground and the background where the action is taking place are in focus. John Barry wasn't the only Bond associate working on the Ipcress File. Production designer Ken Adam and editor Peter Hunt have both been crucial in the worldwide success of 007, but it was Barry's soundtrack that elevates the Ipcress File into the iconic. Evocative, spare and lean, it was music for the modern atomic age. Still in his early 30s, Barry was on a roll during this period, composing groundbreaking and unique scores seemingly by the week. Aptly, in 1964, Michael Caine was staying in John Barry's spare room, and like Caine, Barry had worked hard for his success. They were part of a new breed entering the rarefied world of the arts, where in the past it would have been an unlikely career path. Created using an instrument called a cymbalum, a trapezoid box on legs with metal strings stretched across the top and played by striking the strings with two sticks, the opening theme is archetypal 1960s. You hear it and bang, you're transported back to 1965, the middle of the decade and before the original spurt of youthful optimism and empowerment began to wane, as the idealism of the counterculture clashed with the real world and begat protest and violence. It's a theme that purrs espionage and subterfuge and deadly deeds conducted under the cover of darkness, and one whose influence has not diminished but gathered resonance over the years. Its unique sound still crops up in espionage-based films. It points the audience in a certain direction. In the 1990s, pop culture cottoned on to the tonal signature of Barry's 60s soundtracks, influencing artists such as Portishead and the Sneaker Pimps. In the second film, Funeral in Berlin, released in 1966, Palmer exchanges old-school bureaucracy for the localised fluid dynamics of the new front line. Berlin was the crossroads of the bull-headed sociopaths driving the Cold War. Palmer is once again the small cog in the grinding machine involved in the day-to-day dirty work in the internecine arena of spies, traitors, Janus-faced adversaries and murderers. Palmer is, of course, more at home in Berlin than he was in London. This is familiar territory, one where he formerly made a killing cheating the natives with his black market racketeering, and one where he still has criminal contacts. Based again on the Len Deighton novel of the same name, the Bond connection is once again present, with Goldfinger director Guy Hamilton taking the helm. Funeral in Berlin pales in comparison to the Ipcress File. Not that it is a bad film, it just doesn't feel as groundbreaking and fresh as its predecessor. Some may say the overly complex plots involving defectors, stolen identities and wartime stolen Jewish gold doesn't help the issue, replacing the taut, claustrophobic atmosphere of the first film with a baggy and unwieldy overall impression. Where John Barry's soundtrack had been crucial in creating the essence of the Ipcress File, Konrad Elfer's score for Funeral in Berlin, while certainly having its merits, just feels a tad over-egged and old-fashioned. Barry's lean and sparse musical motifs were the perfect fit for the character of Harry Palmer, the decade and the vicious modernity of the Cold War he was operating in. Elfer's strident Germanic rhythm was an all too predictable fitting of the brief. It was set in Berlin after all, and it was a return to the overly educated old school way of doing things, and that simply wasn't Harry Palmer.
See you later, love.
It does, however, contain one of the best lines from the series.
Have you ever thought of it, sir?
What, Palmer?
Defecting. I have.
Scripted once again from Len Deighton's novel of the same name, Billion Dollar Brain, released in 1967, is ultimately a frustrating film. Palmer is now a struggling private detective, living in his office and surviving a frugal existence on cornflakes, when he is lured to Helsinki and into the path of crazed Texan oil tycoon General Midwinter and his plan to invade Latvia and create rebellion against the commies in the Soviet Union. The opening 45 minutes in sub-zero snowbound Helsinki are ripe with atmosphere and potential. Clearly director Ken Russell was in his element. But Russell, yet to prove himself on a major film, struggles when faced with a plot he didn't know how to approach. And losing the thread, the film limps to a silly bargain basement Bond finale on the frozen Baltic tundra. Caine himself thought the visuals were stunning, but soon regretted recommending Russell to Harry Saltzman, saying that Russell was an emotional genius. Billion Dollar Brain is a highly complicated thriller which needs a draftsman. The last thing you need is an emotional genius. In Caine's words, the ensuing confusion meant no one could give a damn. Like the Ipcress File, Billion Dollar Brain was blessed with a spectacular soundtrack. Scored by Richard Rodney Bennett, it should be recognised as one of the greatest of the decade, and certainly one that deserved more in return from what the film ultimately delivered. Like John Barry's score, Bennett offered something modern and evocative. Driven by harsh metallic piano chords and a sweeping strident melody, it had a bleakness that feels oddly welcoming, an ambiguous icy romanticism fitting the remit of the premise, the wintry setting, the mistrust amongst the glints of tenderness, and the idea of a supercomputer dictating all too gullible human beings, something we're now faced with as we move further into the 21st century. It had more in common with the groundbreaking modernism of Stravinsky than Konrad Elfer's traditional fare for Funeral in Berlin. An early electronic instrument, the Unz Martineau, played with a keyboard or by moving a ring along a wire, creating a trembling, eerie sound similar to a theremin, can be heard to beautiful, haunting effect in those early scenes, lifting Russell's visuals to even greater heights. On a sad note, Billion Dollar Brain was the final film of emerging star Françoise Dorléac, the elder sister of Catherine Deneuve, who tragically died in a car accident in June 1967. A fourth film, again from a Len Deighton novel, Horse Underwater, was provisionally planned but never made. By the way Caine spoke about the experience of Billion Dollar Brain, this is unsurprising. The less said about the two made-for-television films, Bullet to Beijing in 1995 and Midnight in St. Petersburg in 1996, the better. Neither was based on Len Deighton novels and did little to reinvigorate or add to the mythology of Harry Palmer. Palmer, like much of what the 1960s arguably symbolised culturally, was a definite break with the past, with old-school networks, with cap-doffing deference to the establishment. Bond was the establishment, Palmer was the Rolling Stones, although classical music lover Palmer would be horrified at the comparison. Would Harry Palmer have worked in the 1970s? As much as we see the 1960s as modernity in technicolor, youthful optimism and a new aspirational working class, the 1970s emerges from the fog of the past as riven with industrial strife. Dour men in donkey jackets smoking roll-ups on a picket line outside functional Victorian industrial buildings. The working classes were seemingly manoeuvred back to type, no longer aspirational, but confrontational. Harry Palmer was a 1960s icon. That's where he belongs. Let's leave him there.